Alright, there we go. This is just a quick little stream. I really won't stay on for very long. I'll probably only read a chapter or two. I thought I had everything set up and just remembered I don't. There we go. Alright. Now I have everything set up. This is a different fic than what I was reading last time. I just ordered a camera, so I should have a camera next week when I stream. Very exciting, very exciting. This is a very long fic, but it is, I haven't finished it yet, but it is one of my favorites. It is 200,000 words and 32 chapters. I started reading it a while ago, and I hadn't finished it yet, but it's something I really enjoyed. I really like their writing style, so I thought I might read it for y'all today. And this is an extremely abnormal day and time for me to be streaming. So, yeah. The content warnings are up at the top for blood and gore, eating disorders, panic attacks, and dissociation. This does have some graphic depictions of violence, mostly canon typical to the show, which, if you've watched season 2, can be quite a lot, and this does contain spoilers if you're not caught up to the anime. I don't think it gets into the manga too much. Where this starts is in the second season, and then it goes back to the past. It's very fun. It's a time travel fix-it fic, and I really like how it kind of ends up being a character study on Satoru Gojo. But yeah, it's very good. But it starts off pretty heavy, so just be prepared for that. He's choking, rattling and raspy, withering gurgles as his sight dies. The column of his trachea, the last splotch of color he can see, and wondering what will happen when he hits the end. His body's finally shutting down. He can feel it beneath the grime and the blood, and the way all his limbs, or what's left of them, are growing cold. How he can't move his fingers anymore. Pools of blood, tacky where they dip in. He wants to let it slip a last whisper, but he can't get his lips to move, their cracked skin too slippery with coppery red. The lump of his tongue he's long since lost, a missing crater in his mouth. I'm sorry, he hears murmured in his head, among the fading whispers crowding his ears. But I'm glad I'm dying. The noise is fuzzy, quieter than it's ever been inside the hell of the prison. He doesn't bother to shut his eyes as he feels his heart stop. What's the point? He's going to be found soon if the prison really does open. Why give anyone false hope? I'm sorry. Death is almost warm, like a sunlight on his skin. Satoru? He flinches, blind, but not from the lack of light. He stares and keeps staring, fingers shuddering up to his throat where they trace feather light along the unbroken, undamaged, unscarred skin. Where's his esophagus, his trachea? Where's the throat he ripped out, the blood he choked on? Why is there only unblemished skin and the sun? It's bright, fire in the sky, and too saturated for his eyes to process. Too much as they consume everything. His brain throbs in his skull, taking in the sight of the Tokyo Technical College, the forest surrounding it, the individual waving of the leaves as they ruffle in the breeze. The clamor of the people beyond Tengen's humming, buzzing barrier, moving like ants in the thousands, pinpricks of light and energy, making his vision swim. the catch of curses as they flare in the horizon, a blight on his senses and overwhelming with everything else. Satoru? The word rings, fuzzy in his ears, as it whines like tinnitus, familiar and heart-stopping. I'm dead. He can't even hear his own thoughts over the loudness of the world, staggering where he stands, eyes still fixated on the sky, on the sun. I'm dead. I died. I felt my heart stop. This can't be. It can't. Hey. It comes again, a little more urgent than before, a little closer, another hammer to his ears, and all the noise shrieking behind his eyes. He recoils hard enough to go stumbling as a hand reaches for him, covered in flesh rather than empty bone, tan and recognizable. Unbelievable. He might make a noise, maybe a whimper or a soft whine, but if he does, he can't hear it over the pounding in his head, bursting with all of the world's noise after what had felt like years of darkness and nothing. People 10, 20, 80 miles away, creatures scratching through the forest, the sorcerers moving about within the school, the drag of his own shoes on stone path as he stumbles and sways. Make it stop. Make it stop, make it stop, he thinks, but doesn't hear himself say, choking on the flesh inside of his mouth, the plea dripping from his lips like the dark, slick copper of his own blood from just a blink ago. It's hot on his skin, sticky and warm. It's hot? There's something wet trickling from his nose. Bile stings on the back of his tongue. The words dissolve into the rest of the white noise as he stares up at the blue of the sky and tries to remember if he'd ever had a hallucination as bright as this. There's an enemy over his shoulder, a friend in his frozen posture, and the sun shines down on it all as Satoru finally drops to his knees. It's bright, it's so bright, and he thought he'd never get to see it again. I have to be dead, he hears before the stone rises to meet him. Quick pause while I shift settings. Well, that's not what I wanted to do. See everything a little bit better. When his eyes crack open again, oh, nope, that's going to cover my mic, which is important. We're just going to have to suffer with not being able to see chat very well. When his eyes crack open again, his first thought is that they shouldn't be. The thing he's lying on is softer than anything he's felt since the blackness became his sky, and as he flinches as the world trickles back in, it's loud. It's so loud. He's never had a loud one before. The hallucinations scream. Maybe, but they're never loud like this. Then again, he thought the same thing when he'd started seeing faces in the shadows, familiar eyes in the invisible, infinite walls. His throat feels whole when he skims his fingertips along his jugular, unbroken skin and soft forehead. It's not unreasonable. The injuries are quick to disappear when he's caught in a dream. Maybe he's just asleep again, and choking, trying to swallow around the tongue he knows he's pulled out because it isn't real. When he sits up, a thin blanket falls off his shoulders, clad in the dark uniform he'd worn when he'd been a kid, before he'd changed the collar to a scoop neck to hide the scars from the spear of heaven. It's odd, a little uncomfortable against his throat while he's trying to remember how to swallow. It's marginal, though, barely a phantom compared to the other things he's felt since being consumed. When he swings his feet over the edge of the small clinic bed, the warm browns of the wooden furniture and the honey warmth of sunbeams staining his vision, he thinks it's a lot better than some of the other dreams he's had. Sometimes they take a while to devolve into pain and misery and blame, but they're usually never peaceful. He's always still doing something, being somebody, moving like he'd worked so much that it had imprinted itself into his soul. His feet are smaller when he stares down at them, his shoes missing. That's odd, but it fits with the old uniform, he supposes. He hasn't had a dream about being young again for a while. When he stands, he wavers, the pressures in his head expanding like a balloon as his vision blackens, fading to nothing for a long moment as the noise bursts in his ears, and then it's returning, the woozy feeling, all that remains of the temporary faint. He blinks, shakily letting go of the bed rail as he stumbles away, one foot in front of the other as he walks, feet unfamiliar and going nowhere remembered. He wanders for a long while, head swiveling around and around as he watches the bright, colorful energy flares of people and objects move throughout the school. Odd after so long outside of it. He drags his tongue over his teeth as he trails his fingertips along the old wood of the walls. Eyes shut, save for when he passes another huge blindness bay window. The sunlight looks like spider webs as it streams in, dust motes floating within the golden of its rays, dotting the floor in burning stripes of liquid light. He walks for a long while, wondering, it isn't a bad dream. It's mostly just peaceful, wandering aimlessly through the expanse of the school, staying far away from where he can see the colors of people flickering through the walls. He knows there are things looking for him. They chase after his residuals, false and real, slow and yet hurried. He can't tell if they're real or not, just like how he can't tell if the impression of Riko and Suguru down in the energy-bright catacombs of the Star Tome deep below the school are real. It doesn't matter anyway. He knows, skimming his fingers along the dusty window ledge of the wall, eyes shut against the soft brightness of the honey wooden hallway. It's a dream. The monsters will find him if they want. Either he stops it before they can and creates another, or he lets it keep going and risks getting stuck until it ends. He can't quite decide, hanging in a limbo of indecision as he walks, feet padding softly and near soundlessly on hardwood, breathing in the old, paper-tinged smell of ancient and trees and dust. Maybe it would be better if he were to break a window and fall until he wakes. Or maybe it would be better to keep walking, running from the monsters before they can catch him. Maybe it would be better if he put another streaking set of gashes into his neck. Or maybe it would be better to keep playing quiet and silent, a ghost flickering through old hallways he'd never bothered to walk before. He doesn't particularly want to leave. Dreams are the only places he can remember the prickles of limitless under his skin, the hollow of infinity separating him from the world. They're never peaceful, but they're the only oasis from the whispers and the glares and the screams that shriek in his ear that it's his fault. Always his fault, all his fault. It's nice to have nothing for once, he sighs, taking another turn as he pads through the top of the school's... Oh, I lost my place. Forgotten maze-like twists. There's old classrooms and storerooms up here, and it makes him wonder if he ever saw it before. Did it actually exist once? Or is it just his imagination, creating an escape from the things that slowly hunt him down, floors and floors below? He thinks he'll keep wandering until they catch him, because for once, he doesn't want to leave. He likes the tranquility too much to let it go, likes the soft beams of light and the library-like smell of oldness, likes the quiet without the whispers. Maybe he'll regret it when the monsters catch him, when they tear him apart by his flesh, tell him horrible things that he knows are all from his own mouth. But maybe he won't. Maybe the hazy eon of small peace will be worth another death. He walks, protected from the noise of the world for the smallest moment, fingertips tracing walls and windowsills, eyes open to catch the liquid of the sun and the blue of the sky. They find him eventually, just like he knew they would. He watches the window instead of behind himself, where they stumble into the hallway in twisting masses of chatter that fall silent when they see him, looking away even as the sight makes his eyes burn from too much light. He doesn't know how this dream will end, what nightmare it will turn into, but he's made his choice, he supposes. He doesn't really want to leave whatever lucidity has flooded his brain to create this place, even though it's probably going to be bloodied in but a moment. "What the hell, Satoru? We've been looking for you for hours," one says, marching towards him, and he watches it come closer, wrapped in fuzzy edges and jittering, faceless blackness. He flinches when it gets close enough to reach him, one long-fingered hand outstretched toward his shoulder, and only stares when it pauses. And it stops, the pit of its facelessness seemingly scrutinizing him. "Hey," it says. "It's just me." Like it's not trying to reach out to hurt him. He watches it, its flickering image, the harsh lines scattering over its body to hide the image of the person he can't see and doesn't want to see, confused. "Satoru?" it asks, his name fuzzy and heavy in his ears. Intrigued, he lets his eyes shut, cursed energy filling his vision with colors he can never name, and slowly walks back, expanding his sight as he expands their distance. It's a twisting thing, calm even as it roils with emotions, confusion and hurt and a little fear, annoyance and puzzlement. It stays put even when he backs away, feet soundless as they ghost along the floor until his back hits the rickety old doors of a cabinet in the equally old storeroom he's wandered into. Shit, he can hear them curse, mutterings drifting in and out of his ears like crackling, snapping static. What's wrong? Don't know, could be anything. Strain? Not like him. Try again. Slower. No sudden, unlike, don't, gotta be. He stays watching their flickers sway like firelight behind his shut eyes. Pressed up against the squeaky cabinet door, he doesn't move, even when they turn back to him fully. Nonsense images face to face opposite himself. "Satoru," one says, so familiar, and he knows that voice, hates that voice. "Open your eyes." He loves that voice. Wants it to go away and leave him be to wander this dusty, peaceful afterlife. Silently, he shakes his head, not wanting to see the roiling black masses instead of people. "Please, can you look at me?" It repeats, creeping a step closer that he tenses at, shoulders rising, his face tightens as his nose scrunches, eyes pulled taut with stress even as they stay stubbornly shut. He shakes his head again, watching the cursed energy ripple, flaring in frustration. "Come on," it pleads, taking another step closer, and he freezes, stilling as his muscles stiffen. The monster freezes too, stopping for a long moment as it seems to contemplate something. He jerks against the cabinet as a sharp, jagged movement slices across his vision, eyes snapping open in his panic. The faceless thing stands opposite him, the other in the back of the room in front of the door, its line-slashed hands jittering like spools of living thread as they hover in front of itself. "Look at me," it says. "No one's here but you, me, and Shoko." Shoko, he thinks, brows furrowing as he slides his gaze from the first thing to the one guarding the door. Shoko? But his thoughts trail off, eyes darting between the monsters as they writhe without moving in his vision, beginning to recognize pieces of something different between every harsh scribble of black. "It's just me and Shoko," the one in front of him repeats, hands held in front of itself as it steps closer again, and then closer still when he doesn't recoil. He watches it, eyes its hands, knows it's a trap, doesn't quite care. He's never had a dream do this before, lucid or not. Slowly, tentatively, he uncurls his hand, twitching repeatedly from false starts and split-second changes of mind before he's letting his fingers unfurl to reach out. Just a little. He can't help the jump that crawls through his shoulder when the black thing's fingers bump against his own, disturbingly solid and human below the hallucination. It's not real, he thinks, eyes blinking a bit wider as he stares at where the darkness begins to fade, dripping from the hand that touches his own to reveal tan skin and human fingers. But then, what is all of this? He wonders, dragging his eyes over the whole room, confusion tugging at his mind. Hey, eyes on me, the thing says. The person, him, he realizes. "Suguru," he whispers, watching the darkness melt away from kind eyes he remembers being so cold, rediscovering uneven bangs and furrowed brows, a ghost he hasn't seen look so rested in years. "Yeah," Suguru says, "it's just me," and turns up his palm in an offer that Satoru drops his eyes down to stare at. He doesn't understand. This isn't right. It doesn't go like this. When Suguru shows up, they fight, or they die, or he smiles as Satoru loses more of himself like it hadn't been him in that station singing death. He wars with himself for a long moment as he hovers his hand above that warm, welcoming palm, untrusting but trusting but confused but wanting to know, is it you? He wonders and thinks about the dream he's in. It's been unusually peaceful. Typically, the guillotine has dropped and the misery has started by now. What do I have to lose, he thinks. I thought I died already anyway. What's another death, really? And gently sets skittish fingers down into Suguru's waiting hand. He can't help the way he tenses at the contact when it happens, can't help his sharp inhale or the woozy feeling that resurges from somewhere it had been hiding in his stomach. How rare, he knows, how rare to touch someone, even outside the hell of that place. He lets himself be guided when Suguru pulls him out of the crook of the cabinet's battered doors, barely able to think as his head spins, the fog clearing in and the peace trickling out. How strange, he can think, as Suguru's hands trace up his arms, palms guiding him to the door. Shoko is just as eerie when she reappears beyond the doorway, shedding the shadows as they pass through it, her brown eyes narrowed as she looks him up and down. He doesn't bother to think too hard about it as they pull him back down through the never-ending hallways, catching him each time he starts to float off. He's never had a good dream with Suguru before. Maybe this one will be the first. Follow the pen, Shoko tells him, once they've sat him back down in the bed that he abandoned, dragging a pin left and right in front of his face. He scrunches his nose, complying even as he doesn't know why he's being asked to do such a silly thing. He can't remember the meaning of it, why she stares so intently at his eyes as he moves them back and forth, up and down, chasing after the pen as it's hovered around and around. She sighs, setting it on the side table with a small clacking sound as she turns away, rifling through drawers for something else. I don't understand it. You seem fine, she mutters, almost to herself, and Satoru only puffs out his cheeks, craning his head back to stare through the ceiling, up at the fizzling noise of Tengen's barrier. Don't do that, Suguru murmurs, one palm circling at the back of his skull to push his face upright again, and he rolls his eyes, lamenting the fact that this softer, attentive version of Suguru won't let him get up and wander. He's just pushed back down onto the side of the bed, one of his hands holding him there by the shoulder when he tries. It's beyond odd. Every little brush of contact has him shivering and shying away, rethinking this weird dream and the one before it, wondering if they're related somehow beyond just in succession of his fractured memory. Okay, Shoko calls, walking back over, twirling a tool between her fingers. I'm gonna temporarily blind you. No complaining about it. He doesn't get a chance to scatter away before she's grabbing his chin and tilting his face up, a small flashlight shining into one of his eyes. He snaps them shut immediately, unaccustomed to discomfort like it when all of his pain is usually gashes and slices and gouges. Damn it, Suguru, hold him still, Shoko mutters, and he can't help a jerk when a slightly larger hand replaces a smaller, colder one that had been on his chin, holding his face up and steady when he tries to yank it away at the feeling of two fingers prying his left eye open. He knows it's a dream, but he still feels the panic when the pair to the hand on his face wraps around both his wrists in one singular shackle. It's reminiscent of the dreams he sometimes gets, the too real hallucination, always of people that want his eyes or want him dead. The touch of them is usually ghost-like, a whisper rather than a pressure, despite the pain of having his eyes torn from his skull that always feels so real. They come back after everyone when he wakes up and blinks them open. He's never found them as little marbles of jelly by his legs like he had the fleshy meat of his tongue, but it's forever been a fear in the back of his mind that one day he might gouge them out for real. Fuck's sake, Satoru, Shoko complains when he still strains and struggles as Suguru holds him still. It's not like it's eye drops. He grinds his teeth as the light finally leaves, eyes screwing shut just in time for the other to be forced open, remembering how they'd used to hold him down years ago just to get anti-inflammatory drops into his reddened, overly dry eyes. How the memories had twisted into something rancid, something darker as the days had passed without the rise and set of the sun. He makes a noise, an unhappy whine that Suguru sighs at and Shoko ignores. The light stays put, black spots burning in his vision like old film reel as he's forcibly held still until Shoko drops the tool away and Suguru lets his face go, blinking his shut eyes against the reddened flares of after images. Sorry, Suguru murmurs, one hand tentatively resting on his back. She's just trying to make sure you're okay, you know. Satoru shakes his head, ignoring the words for the most part as he shivers because they're so odd compared to everything else. Not when it's always gory and bloody and miserable, and this isn't. Whatever, he mouths, soundless, ever surprised when his tongue skims the roof of his mouth. With the silent words, "Oh," he thinks, "that's right, I'm dreaming." He opens his mouth again to actually say something, only to stop. The ghost of a whisper edging along the shell of his ear. Pathetic, it says. The same barely there specters that had always snapped at his heels in the darkness of the prison. What? He ends up asking, head turning to catch the sound, missing Suguru's frown and Shoko's glance. I didn't say anything, Suguru says, leaning closer like he's trying to see what Satoru is and failing for it. Slowly, he shakes his head, struggling to tear his eyes away from the far wall where there is nothing. He sighs as he finally looks back to Suguru, opening his mouth to say something because he can actually speak, and how interesting is that? A smile catches his eye over his shoulder, too curled and too malicious. His eyes miss Suguru's face entirely for it. This doesn't make any sense, he thinks, the words a little hysterical clanging around in his head as he watches the fake hold a finger up to its lips, the stitches on its forehead stark against its washed-out skin. Dreams are always a little weird, and it's true that most of them feature that thing in them somewhere, but that's a hallucination, he knows, ignoring the way Suguru on the bed next to him waves a hand in front of his eyes, pokes his shoulder, calls his name. His gaze stays trapped on the fuzzy edges of the imposter's not quite right robe, the lack of cursed energy encompassing it, its thinness. It isn't right. Slowly, he looks between Suguru at the end of the room and the Suguru beside him, blinking through their differences. One looks real. The other looks almost flat in the lighting of the clinic. One is surrounded by the flicker of cursed energy, the other is a void of nothing. One is trying to get his attention until he's turning around and yelling something about Shoko, and the other is silent, still staring only at him. He doesn't get hallucinations when he dreams. He swallows thickly as he brings a hand up to his eyes, tracing over the fan of his lashes as he pokes a little more at the prickle of limitless. Limitless. It rises around his skin like a shield when he wills it to, and suddenly he can't breathe. Limitless had been inaccessible within the prison. He hadn't had enough cursed energy to raise it, what with almost all of it being suppressed. He'd saved the meager little trickle of it for injuries he hadn't been stupid enough to say he wouldn't be getting. It had knit him back together the first couple of times he'd lost enough of himself to do something big like scratch out a femoral or radial artery, but still have enough left to know he needed to live. It had run out by the time he'd clawed out his tongue, scratched his face to ribbons, left huge, jagged scars down his body to match the one Megumi's deadbeat of a dad had given him, only stopped every time his shredded nails had needed to regrow from their beds. The stasis of the cube had kept infection from eating away his flesh, had kept his blood flow sluggish and syrupy, had kept him alive enough to suffer as he had tried to die. Limitless, however, had always been out of reach. He stares down at his hands, infinity a thrum over his skin, and blinks the black spots from his eyes as the dizziness sends his vision swimming. This isn't a dream. The days, is it days? Maybe it's just a day, passes in a blur, time bleeding together in what he can't pick apart as one moment from many, one oddity after another, confusing and unable to be untangled that he scrabbles for some kind of answer. He thinks there's only one of them. He thinks there's a million of them. There's Shoko, younger and less cynical, less indifferent, and still as brash as she'd been as a kid before the apathy had overgrown in her like the weeds of morning glory vines. There's Suguru, softer and more worried and himself still before everything had washed him away into somebody new in the red of all the blood he'd spilled. And then there's him, unbelonging, a piece of a puzzle that doesn't fit. Liar, the shadows whisper in his ears when Suguru asks him if he's okay, and he says he's fine as he stares at a face that can't possibly be real. Because this isn't real, they hiss when he sits through a class like he's 15 and still untouchable, drifting through it as if watching an old memory on a film reel. Disgrace, they call him as he finally runs away after the sun's set again and he's refused to close his eyes to let sleep destroy his world. He runs, bare feet, pounding through the underbrush of the forest as he flees the safety of the school, the suffocating wood of its walls, and the dream that might be a nightmare after all. He gasps and runs harder, farther away from Shoko's comments about his spaciness and Suguru's gentle hands as they take every excuse to touch him with worry, with concern, with relief he wants to let them have, and yet he doesn't know how to hold. Tengen's barrier is a solid wall when he crashes into it, a dome that cuts intangibly into the earth as he beats his fists against it, unknowing why he can't get past. Is there only one way in, one way out? Had it been passable? Hadn't been tangible, except he can't remember. Hands shaking as he flickers like a ghost higher up, palms dragging down the invisible, thrumming fizzle of it. He can't remember anything. How he used to live, how he used to breathe, how he used to love Suguru before he'd become a monster. He screams, a wailing, helpless caterwaul of a thing, crashing his head against the dome, shoulders curling up into feet and sinking back down into the grass, the snapped twigs, moss, and old leaves. He can't remember how to be human, he thinks. Arms dragging down energy he should be able to get past. He can't remember anything about himself. His hands shake as his nails, his unbroken whole nails, dig into his collarbones, lips splitting into wobbly characters as his eyes burn. He doesn't remember how to live, can't recall how he'd spent every day before the darkness acting like a human when it's become so distant. Can't recall how he made the act in the first place, when all he can remember was that it was one, when all he knows is that it hadn't been real. He'd ripped himself into pieces in the darkness with just the skeletons as witnesses, had torn up little humanity he had left and been eaten alive by the things he'd kept guarded against behind Limitless and a facade. Dying had been easy when he'd done it, if he'd done it. He'd wanted to die, had been glad for it even, and maybe he can't remember how to be human, but he does remember being a god, and every day that he'd wake up wishing it was his last. Ever hidden by the act he'd worn like a mask. He can't remember how to live, when he spent his whole life wanting to die. Is it really any wonder why you lost so much blood? The voices hiss, too high in his ears and too knowing as he curls into himself on the forest floor. Don't you know why you turned your nails into knives? Don't you know why slicing your skin open was so easy? He tells them to shut up, cries for them to go away because he hates them, but they're right. Because he hates them when they're only pieces of himself. How is he supposed to live if he'd only ever wanted to die? He doesn't purposely sleep that night, trudging through the forest as if walking to a noose on a rope, a guest in his own body, too little, too small, too young, unscarred. Eventually, the darkness does come back in the walls of a room he hasn't seen in over a decade, and he's almost welcoming of it. At least he knows what horrors lie in the blackness and the emptiness. At least he understands the world of the prison. He doesn't remember how to live in this dream. Also, the fic titles are Hosier songs, and that brings me great joy. Chapter 2, Wasteland Baby. He feels like he's going to die. The breath in his lungs squeezes itself non-existent, the wrung-out feeling trembling his limbs is exhausting. The wild, frenzied mania shaking his eyes and his skull rattles around what little proper thought is left. He's tired, he's electric, he's a gust of wind in a quiet desert, eclectic and haywire and silent and still. Where am I? He thinks, where am I? Where am I? Where am I? And then, is this real? He doesn't know. God, he doesn't know. Pain doesn't work, understood when he stares down at his legs and don't see scars that might or might not be there, depending on his perfection of his own prowess and powers. The dragging, scratching nail marks that might linger in faded pink lines carved jagged and shorn into the velvet skin of his thighs. If only the reversal of all his negativity might have stoppered in time to leave them. He doesn't know if he let it. He doesn't know if it did. He knows he could make new ones. The pinprick of nails into his skin as a suggestion is both less and more harsh than the sickly, wan light of the night time, and the moonlight that trickles in through his window, parted by two curtains like the blinking of an eye. It stares as he leaves a clawed hand against thin and delicate skin. Thick and sturdy muscle, tense and wired body, the artery he could slice through, he could leave new marks, but it wouldn't be worth anything. There'd be no meaning in doing it other than resurfacing to a potential reality, one that might not even be the end of a delusion, that might not be a delusion at all. Where am I? Where am I? Where am I? He thinks. The rapid bangs of thought loud against each other like the crack of boots beating down on the ground as they run. It could be real, it could be fake, it could be the dark and the dank and the quiet. The musty hell of that prison that reeks of the dead slowly rots him along with their molded bones and hopes and dreams. Pain has never given him an answer before, because when one hallucination ends, another just fills its space. And the cycle starts again. He's woken up from a dream before to find blood and skin bunched under his two long fingernails, a tearing in his head clinging loudly and gouges in his body by his own hands. Am I real? He thinks, and doesn't dare to wonder. Instead, he stumbles, unsteady, tipping steps down the hallway made of hardwood and chilly, drafting breezes, taking care to avoid the boards that were permanently squeaky once upon a time. Were they real, he thinks, once upon a time? His world is tilted in flickering shadows, the impressions of people and a permanent strain on his eyes from fireworks of curses in the distance. Visible despite the span of the walls of this dream stretched out in front of himself, he keeps walking, keeps putting one foot in front of the other, no matter how badly he wants to just put claws into his jugular and get it over with. Because another life he can't have being ended is better than living knowing it's fake. That one, that door, he thinks, and barely registers the thought before he's swaying towards a door that's long since been familiar, long since grown unfamiliar. He knows the sound it'll make before he opens it, knows the slight stick of the hinges and what waits for him on the other side. A dusty, empty room, he thinks, and then him. Quietly, the door whines, the hinges protest a little, a small beg against their movement that's of no interest to him. He steps from cold hardwood onto soft carpet. A little one of many in the room that was dusty and silent and empty, kept because they made it less chilly. It isn't dusty or empty when he finally pads inside, but it is silent. A long slice of moonlight catches off the windowsill and drags a moonbeam down the floor in broken pieces as it catches on furniture, clothing, books, items strewn about in a messy sort of orderly. A dusty, empty room, he thinks, eyes scouring the floor and all of its proof of life, and then... But it's him. It's him. He's always been real. A shift of movement in the bed catches his eye, has him darting his gaze up from where he stands, frozen at the threshold beyond the door, eyes catching and latching onto the figure that gradually reshapes itself from Frankenstein shadows into that of a person. He stands and he waits, and maybe he wonders if what he will see will be the scientist or the monster. Toru? Suguru gradually mumbles, barely audible in the dead and the quiet of the middle of the night. He freezes, all the breath evaporating in his lungs as he stands still, stands quiet, stands in hope. He refuses to let it infect him, thinking, am I real? Are you real? Satoru? Suguru tries again, hands falling from where they'd been rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He sits up fully, clear gaze becoming more and more visible in the dark as the drowsiness flights from his eyes. replacing itself with an awareness, a soft alarm. Dark brows laced together, a set of lips pinching thinner with them. "Hey," he says, and his voice sounds real, sounds close, sounds like it might be hope that could crush him if he's wrong again. That hope is an infection that will see him dead sooner than the rot spreading from the leftover skeletons will. It's gutted him before. He isn't sure what it will do if given the chance to take more organs from his underbelly. "Shit," Suguru hisses in a whisper as he slinks from his blankets and pillows in rest, sliding from his bed to pad softly and silent. Closer, closer, closer. Back, back, back. He steps in turn until wood hits his shoulders and his heels can't go any further. And though he looks wildly with shaken, frenzied gaze for an escape, none comes. Suguru gets closer, closer, closer still until he's but a pace away. Hands in front of himself like he thinks it's placating instead of disquieting when he doesn't know that he might not be real. "Satoru," Suguru tones, low and calm, in a well of anxiety if he's looking for it. "You're in my room. It's night. Everything's okay." He sounds uncertain, confident, and yet unsteady with it, like he isn't sure what's wrong, like he doesn't know, and he doesn't. Suguru doesn't know at all. "Satoru?" Suguru says again, and instead of the gurgle of a creek, it's the bark of a stream, sharp and harsh enough to catch his attention and make it stay there. Those dark eyes stare at him far too intently for a dream, and he can feel that infuriating infection spreading more, taking over his shaky limbs and pinning his eyes to the face that hasn't been in so long, too long. At an impasse, they stand and they stare. He doesn't waver his gaze, no matter how much the infection makes his lungs burn and his heart pound. This isn't real. Has a harsh drumbeat against his ribs that he doesn't want to believe, and yet should if he wants to protect what little softness he has left. Suguru stares him down, down, down into the abyss of his resolve, and seems to find one of his own with the way he suddenly changes. In movement, he doesn't look away to catch swings faintly in his peripheral, and within something dry is brushing against his hand with a warmth he doesn't have. He freezes where he stands, wishing for the rush of breath or the drumbeat of his heart or the clacking march of his thoughts, but they vanish. The infection feels like a fever burning through him, as if he's a forest to set to flame. It's addictive and tantalizing and maybe even real. Like he's a marionette fighting its maker's string, his head slowly turns, eyes falling down to stare at where another set of calloused fingers brush against his own. Pain has never given him an answer before, because when one hallucination ends, another just fills its place. And the cycle starts again, despite the blood clogging his fingernails and thickly coating his tongue. For all his perfection, he's never been able to recreate what he cannot have in that little black hell. Suguru is only a determination in the corner of his eyes, as he's deliberate in his motions, gentle in how he clasps their hands like it's an answer he's found and refuses to let go of. Satoru stares down at flesh that isn't decay or rot and isn't his own, and then this is real. His lips grow watery first, his eyes follow second, and then he's breathing in air that feels like it doesn't carry the reeking of death in its recycled currents. Satoru squeezes Suguru's hand in his own and tries not to remember the claustrophobia of the four walls that kept him within darkness and never-ending eternity, trapped with nothing but the dead to keep him company and his own hallucinations to pass the time. "Okay," Suguru mutters, worry evident in his whispering tone. And Satoru finally closes his eyes against the sting, nodding as the silence of the room with the loudness of the world outside trickles back in, the creak of the cicadas, the faint sound of a river, the sway of the trees in the wind like a dim roar of the ocean. How he'd ran, only to wander right back. When had he fallen asleep, he wonders. Satoru hums, refusing to open his mouth for a sob to spill out instead. He follows when Suguru tugs him forward, blinks through hot, sight-staining tears to follow footsteps that pull him in further to a room that isn't dusty or empty, but only silent. "Come on, it's late," Suguru says, pulling him down into the strewn-about duvet and mess of pillows, and Satoru follows, spilling next to him the blankets like a melted liquid. "Try and sleep," is mumbled near his ear as hands drag him down into the softness of a bed he remembers invading years and years ago. And then they're dragging the blankets up too, and the warmth spreads through him like a fever. The hands follow after it, running sparkling trails of shivers up his sides as they read him like a road on a map, running along the drawn-on lines of his body until they make their way to his head, to settle on the... Ooh. until they make their way to his head, to settle on the round of his cheeks, thumbs resting in the hollows below his eyes. It's like an inferno, the heat they radiate into his skin. But they're like touching bottled lightning, too. Fizzy and tingling and electric where Suguru's fingertips brushed the edges of his jaw, the thin skin under his eyes he'd clawed to ribbons once. Satoru welcomes it, despite how it makes him feel like a star about to explode. It's proof, it's good. It's not him wasting away in nothingness, wallowing in the waste of his own failures and regrets. A thumb brushes a lock of white hair away from his eyes, before curling over his ear to settle on the back of his head, carding through soft strands like they're water in the koi ponds to ripple without end. His nose is cold when it meets Suguru's neck, and though he shivers, "Stay here," is what Suguru whispers when Satoru lets himself fall into him in his warmth. He snakes his hands around Suguru's body, holds on as tight as he dares, and chooses to trust what he cannot have again. He'll lay here for as long as it takes, until sleep or unconsciousness steals away the thoughts that, though silenced by the soft stroke of Suguru's hands against his skin, his hair still clamor as loudly as they can. He squeezes tighter, presses closer. This is real, he thinks. This is real. Something pokes his cheek, scrunching his nose. Satoru turns his head away. A voice murmurs, and then the thing pokes him again. "Hey, I know you're awake." He ignores that, choosing instead to sink a little deeper into his pillow. His hands are warm, for once, and his thoughts still feel syrupy slow. "Wake up." He frowns when it comes again, more muddied than the first time, twitching at the silence that follows. Satoru tightens his hold on the blanket. Where did it... "I said wake up," rings shrill in his ears, clanging like a church bell as a miasma swallows his sense of smell, sharp and sour enough to have his eyes flying open. I don't know if you could just hear the noise of my cat jumping off of my bed. Hello. He trembles where he lies, staring out at the abyssal void of nothing, fingernails digging into the dusty thing that isn't quite like ground below him, long since decorated with the charred, molded remains of old bones that stain the walls of the hell he's known well for too long now. It was real, is all he can think before the burn starts up in his waterlines. But it was real. No video because I don't have a camera yet. I did, however, get some money, so I was able to order one. So I should have one next week. I'm getting it on Friday, so I won't have it for this stream on Thursday, but next Thursday I should be able to have my video on, and hopefully I'll stream before Thursday. But until I get a camera, I cannot... Because I don't have anywhere... If I had somewhere to set up my laptop that I could stream, I would do that, but I can't set my laptop on my desk because there's too many things happening on my desk. He opens his eyes without any breath in his lungs, all the air chased out by the fear that creeps in and takes its place, thick and cloying, choking when he tries to breathe in again. It's familiar when his hands find his throat, the hollow at the base where he digs his thumbs into, leaving crescent groove marks underneath every finger that finds skin. He's never suffocated before, even though stealing his own consciousness is an old game. He's spilled enough blood by now to know it usually never works, but he's always kept trying. Watching the black spots pop and fizzle in his vision is almost sort of entertaining past the burning feeling, swallowing up his lungs in hungry, desperate tongues of flame. They blot out the soft light filling the room. A place he used to know once upon a time. He hoped somewhere in his scattered head that somebody's been dusting it. The one I was using was my mom's, and she needed it for work, so I was only stealing it sometimes. So that one wasn't actually mine. I was just borrowing it. But I have money now. Well, not a lot of money. I got a little bit, so I was able to order that and some headphones. So I'll have Bluetooth headphones. Oh, that's what I forgot to order. My computer doesn't have a Bluetooth capability because it's old, so I have to order. I need to ask my dad what I need to order to be able to set up Bluetooth in my computer, and then I'll have to go through the horror of turning my turning my thing around so that I can actually take the side off, because I think I have it backwards right now, so I think the part that I can actually access is on the back. I actually need to use the bathroom, so I'm gonna really quickly put y'all on a quick break, and then I will be right back. What do you mean the words are delayed a bit? didn't realize how blurry my screen was. I will need to see if I can fix that, but that is near illegible. His eyes get a little heavier as the stars start to prick and sparkle in his sight, beginning to remember how to forget to fight as his fingers press harder, harder, harder into his skin. A ringing starts up, nearly washing out the sound of footsteps. That's weird, he has time to think, before the face of the hallucination is appearing across the room. It isn't the first time he's seen Suguru while on the edge of a false death. It probably won't be the last either. Except this one is different. Instead of smiling or laughing or looking away, this Suguru furrows his brows, and then he's shouting, lunging forward to cross his small bedroom in a stride or two when it's always Satoru chasing after him. That's weird. Satoru has time to think before something hot is pressing down onto his wrists, and his arms are being forcibly ripped away from himself. A gasp tears from his mouth as some of his skin goes with them, caught under his nails and leaving ugly trails in their wake that would bead ruby red if they'd even a little bit deeper. The pain isn't new. He's used to that. Suguru's hands don't leave his wrists, but clench even tighter where they keep a bruising grasp on his bones as he pins them at his sides on the rumpled duvet. Pain is old. Suguru is new. What are you doing? Is the same shrill thing in his ears as the ring of the church bell that must have been a dream. You idiot, you were about to black out. Suguru looks harried above him, hair wild around his head and eyes even more so. Oh. Satoru thinks, remembering the sobriety of last night. Oh, this is real too. He doesn't say anything. He can't really get his lips to work, not when Suguru hovers over him, penning his arms on the bed, intangible to his own touch. Real and solid and actual, unlike the filaments that like to bother him when his fingers get a little too slick and his skin a little too torn. Well, Suguru says, and his voice is thin, ready almost say something. Satoru furrows his brow, trying to remember where exactly he'd left his tongue. He had torn it out, hadn't he? Or maybe... No, he remembers, as he swipes it across his teeth. It's still somehow there. Probably. He ignores the shadowy figure he can see in his peripherals as he uses it. He mutters, the sound a touch raspy. Something? He says, wincing at the drag against his esophagus. How hard had he squeezed? Above him, Suguru shuts his eyes and draws in a long, pained-looking sigh. You're the worst, he mumbles. The absolute worst. I know. Satoru whispers back and slowly takes a shard of awareness for the rest of himself. He's tangled in Suguru's blankets, overwarm from leftover body heat and weirdly whole for it. He has no deep cuts that he can feel. There's no bones poking into his legs. His fingernails don't feel like there's gore stuffed up under them. Considering his tongue is his mouth again, he must be dreaming. No, he thinks, shutting his eyes as he tries to drag everything back into order inside his head. That's not right. He's been at the tech school again for 2 days now. He hasn't been in that hell. Yesterday, Suguru and I ate lunch together. He thinks and tries to remember what he'd eaten. What was it? He can't recall. I saw Shoko. She was 15. He had, and she is. Still smoking, and still cynical, but not yet a pack a day, and not yet peppered with nihilism. Not yet a part of the world he knew. But isn't she 28? Flashes through his head, and then he's frowning again because Shoko is 28, but he saw her yesterday and she was younger. But that isn't right either. Toru? Suguru murmurs above him, and Satoru blinks his eyes open again, trying to make sense of the inky black that tumbles over and down narrow shoulders, missing the width he knows they'll grow into eventually. Where's your gauges? is what he blurts, still a little stringy and rough from where he's torn up his throat. Suguru makes a face like he said something weird, and Satoru doesn't think he has, but he's also probably lost most of his marbles, even though he's certain that Suguru had gauges to match his ugly robes. What? Suguru stumbles, still giving him that look, edged in a wary sort of concern. I wear studs. Satoru parts his lips to respond to that, only to let the words die on his tongue, because that's also right, he remembers. Suguru started wearing gauges in second year, whispers some old, forgotten part of his mind, and he swallows down the thing he can't remember the name of that crawls up his throat. Oh, he says. It's quiet. Jeez, Suguru softly mumbles, letting go of one wrist to bring his hand up. He presses it to the back of his forehead, an action Satoru can't remember the meaning of, and tacks on. Maybe you have a fever or something. You were running kind of hot, and you were confused last night, too. He seems to be talking more to himself than anyone else, and with a conflicted look back down at where Satoru lays, he sighs. Can you just not do anything while I run to the bathroom for a minute? Satoru furrows his brow, taps his fingers together where he left the hand that Suguru let go of in the same place it was pinned. What? He asks, and Suguru makes another face. I mean, don't do anything. Don't get up, or hell, I don't know, try to suffocate yourself. He says, the words sharp and accusatory. Satoru frowns and opens his mouth to respond with something snarky and annoying before he shuts it with a click of his teeth. Yeah, he mutters and tries not to look cowed. He doesn't want Suguru to know of that place. It's better for now if he keeps it to himself. This is real. It's real. But it would be such a pain to tell him and have him whisper away again into nothing. The suspicious leer he's given is the farthest thing from belief that Satoru can probably get. But Suguru takes him at his word when he rolls his eyes. Fine, he says, short and stiff. Don't move. I'm gonna grab the thermometer. The bed dips as Suguru takes the weight of his knee off of it, swaying up to stand and giving him one last glance over his shoulder before he's padding out of the room again, marching down the hall at a hurried pace. Satoru watches him go, staring at the flickering of energy that follows him through the walls and lights the rest of the world up like a firework, something that had only sparsely manifested itself inside the prison. It's dark in Suguru's room. It's bright outside of it. Sighing down into the pillows, Satoru drags his gaze back up to the ceiling, tracing the old paint with his eyes that feel heavy. Had he dug his fingers into them too? Or had that also only been dreams? He can't remember. It's weird having a tongue again, he thinks, for what isn't the first time. He's woken up and realizes it's in his mouth instead of on the dusty, bone-muddled ground. He decides that he hates waking up, laying in Suguru's old dorm bed and out of place with his own reality, as much as he savors it. All of the memories of the world he's in wash away like the tide and leave him with nothing but the scum and the scud on the sand underneath. Had he torn it out again? Had he bit it or clawed it in the fit of mania that had encouraged him to? It had been enough to put him into nothingness for what must have been a few days, he remembers. Or maybe it had been minutes, or hours that had just felt like days. Tearing at his jugular had made the nothing last longer. The sight of his tongue and the blackness of the ground by his feet when he'd woken up might have beat that, though, for how long he just sat and stared at it. When did pain turn into a game of unconsciousness, he wonders. Okay, Suguru calls from the doorway, twirling the mercury thermometer between his fingers like a pin as he pads back into the room, dark hair swaying behind him. Satoru watches him as he comes to sit on the side of the bed at his ribs, tapping the glass before looking down and raising one thin brow. I didn't move, he says, and Suguru makes a face. Thanks. He responds, dry, and then reaches out to tap the inner side of his chin with the glass. Open your mouth. Satoru does, and the glass is cold when it touches the inside of his cheek. Hey, he says, before Suguru can tell him to shut up and let it sit. I still have a tongue, right? What? Suguru says. The word an off-kilter hiss between his teeth as his brows contort into a myriad of emotions on his face. Yes, why the hell wouldn't you? Satoru looks up at the ceiling and gently bites down on the glass. Don't know, he mumbles. Right, keep that in for at least a minute. Suguru sighs, and once he's made sure Satoru has it where he's supposed to, he flops back onto the bed and subsequently his stomach. The weight is alien, almost. Absently, he remembers to draw a breath in through his nose and quietly marvels at Suguru moving along with his ribs. He stares up at the ceiling and doesn't look when he slowly moves one hand. Suguru's back. He just said not to move while he was gone. He's not gone, right? It's easy to find one of the hands that don't belong to him, but a little harder to nudge it with his own. He feels it on his skin where his shirt's ridden up to expose his stomach when Suguru blinks, before he hooks their two smallest fingers together where Satoru can't. It's a lot like last night. Satoru breathes out, curls his fingers around Suguru's own, and tries to settle. This is real, he thinks, his newest mantra. They lay together without a word for a while. Satoru doesn't know how long because he stopped bothering with counting forever ago. I just knocked stuff over and I'm trying to set it back up. Oh no. Okay, there we go. And lost the ability to tell time just after. It's surprising when Suguru shifts, stretching just far enough to tug the end of the thermometer from between his teeth, holding it above his head to look at it. Huh, he murmurs, and Satoru tugs on his hand. Dark eyes dart up to his face before looking back at the glass, where the mercury inside shines bright red and high. You actually are running hot, right above 37. The thermometer is held out for him to see, and Satoru catches the red resting half a millimeter above 37 degrees Celsius. Oh, he says, it doesn't really mean much. Maybe that's why he's so warm. But what else does he really care? Okay. Suguru pokes him in the side with the butt of the glass before he's reaching over to set it on his nightstand, and he's lightly glaring when Satoru looks down at him to complain about it. Okay, you've got a fever, dumbass. He chides and then mutters below his breath. Maybe that's why you're so out of it. Underneath him, Satoru shrugs. It'll go away eventually. Fevers always did, he can sort of remember. They'd evaporate out of him at some point when he'd been a kid, maybe spelled off by whatever bullshit the trainers had him doing. When he looks back at Suguru, there's something accusatory in the look in his eye, at war with the disbelief written on his face. Is eventually getting up and doing what we were supposed to do today, or laying here? He asks, eyes narrowing, and Satoru tenses, knowing there's a right answer, but feeling it's not the one he has. Getting up? He tries, because that's what he'd always done back at the estate before he'd left, developed a permanent limitless, and stopped getting sick. It's what he'd always done as the only on-call special grade, the strongest everybody else relied on. It's what he'd always done when everybody else needed him, until he'd been unable to be needed. You're useless if you're not working, he thinks, the echo ingrained into his head even decades later. Still lying on top of him, Suguru buries his face in his arm. Wrong, he says, muffled into the crook of his elbow, and Satoru scowls. I'm not laying here all day, he grouses, and Suguru picks up his head. Setting his chin on his arm, he takes one brow high, gaze flat and steady. Oh yeah? He challenges, and Satoru frowns. Yeah, he retorts, and Suguru flicks his eyes up and down over him in the most judgmental thing he thinks he's ever seen. Okay then, he gives. Get up. That's not fair, Satoru stutters, slipping at the prospect of being stuck like this. Get off. The words leave him before he can think about it. He does not, in fact, want Suguru to get off. He also does not, in fact, want to lay here. God, what if he falls asleep again? He doesn't particularly want to wake up and not remember where he put his tongue. He just found it. No, if you want to get up so badly, then just do it, Suguru mocks, leaning further over his stomach. Satoru glares at him, lifting one foot to shove at his side in retaliation, only to get an obnoxious, closed-mouthed smile and drawling, haughty words for it. Oh no, Suguru says, inflectionless, as he shuffles more onto the bed. I'm moving. He reaches out to shove away Satoru's ankle when he's kicked, batting it down to make room for himself. Shoving his thighs flat into the mattress, Suguru swings his leg across his body to sit directly on top of him, choosing to pin rather than weigh down, so that he's got Satoru resolutely stuck in place. He looks smug as he does it, coy and pleased, and like he's just terribly clever. Satoru cannot believe him, cannot fucking believe he ever missed this. This is so terrible, Suguru deadpans. Oh no. The glare he gives Suguru is probably lethal, and yet he still doesn't have the decency to keel over and die. What? Suguru says, smirking when Satoru doesn't say anything, leaning forwards with the heaviness of their combined weight, dipping the whole mattress further down to murmur right by his ear, the dark hair tickling his cheek. Are you trapped? Suguru's knees squeeze his hips, one of his hands resting on the ridges of his ribs, direct attention focused entirely on him and provoking a reaction. Oh God, Satoru thinks as his hands fly up to cover his face, heated even to his own touch and probably scarlet red with how hard he must be blushing. He's going to implode and die. Forget his tongue, forget the prison. This is the worst thing to ever happen to him. Dream or real or dream. Is that a yes? What a shame. Suguru tisks as he leans back again, sitting upright as he stares at the window to their left for a moment when he doesn't respond. A miasma of energy Satoru can see through his closed fingers. Whatever, it was going to rain anyway. Not a whole lot of point in going out. I'm going to die, Satoru thinks, the combination of everything making his head spin. I'm seriously going to die. When was the last time he really touched somebody? Suguru's been tactile with him since the meltdown a day ago? But this is different. He nearly squeaks when the hand on his ribs trails down to rest on the flat of his stomach. It's like how it had used to be, and then never was again. Maybe he'd let everyone else think he'd spent his weekends whoring around, but it had only ever been a farce to make him less respectable and therefore less fear-worthy. He'd only had Suguru in his body for a little while. It's probably too much all at once when he catalogues the tremor in his hands, the ditzy feeling in his head, the stuffing of cotton in his ears. It's just like how everything else had been, since somehow finding a way out of that dark hell, big and loud and too much, a taunt or a promise or both. Simply seeing the sun brought him to his knees. He wonders what would this do if he were standing, when Suguru shines even brighter. Satoru? A hand tugs at his wrist, and just like how Suguru alone can walk unbroken through his infinity, Suguru alone can pull his guard away from him. He lets one eye be uncovered, lets himself be scrutinized, even though he doesn't really remember how to exist under someone else's gaze anymore. Lets Suguru do whatever he wants. Wasn't that how we got into the mess in the first place? He wonders and rips the thought apart as soon as it comes. He dithers for a moment after, stuck in between the softness of the duvet and Suguru's stupid strong thighs. He opens his mouth, shuts it, opens it again, just for nothing to come out. He gives up when his eyes start burning with the combined force of what are probably tears, the strain from being unused to his own sight, the world at large, and general humanity. When the dizziness hits him, he just closes his eyes and lets it have at it. Hey, are you okay? Suguru asks, energy snapping around him and tone leveling out with the quiet of the room, now that he's decided not to be an ass. Satoru lifts his shoulders in a wordless shrug, already hyper-aware of the fingertips that rest halfway on his stomach where his shirt's still rumpled. He wishes he was more exhausted so he could handle it better when the pad of a thumb presses a small circle into the palm of the hand that Suguru lifted from his face. Does he know? He has to know. He doesn't know he's not real. This is real, he thinks, almost reflexively at this point, and doesn't doubt it. The prison was disgustingly underwhelming. This is entirely overwhelming. He doesn't really remember how to do this anymore. He thinks he forgot a long time before he was sealed. When he forgot how to live without wishing to die instead of saying anything about it, though, his tongue stays stuck, glued to the roof of his mouth, and Satoru sits, with the faint spinning of his vision and the too much bubbling up his throat, all spilling out behind his teeth. A gust of wind hits the window, howling faintly behind the glass as Satoru watches from behind his hands at how Suguru's cursed energy flickers and twists. He's anxious. Megami's energy does the same thing. Do you feel bad? Suguru asks, letting his hand go to push his hair back again, resting the backs of his knuckles against the skin of his forehead. Slowly, Satoru shakes his head, scraping for just a few words, the majority of them rattling around loosely in his skull. No, he mumbles from behind his hands, peeking through cracked fingers. It's just loud. Suguru tilts his head, eyeing him for a long moment before he moves again. Loud? He asks quietly, tapping the shell of his ear, partly hidden behind dark hair. Or loud, he says again, moving his hand to tap below his eye. Satoru breathes out a jerky breath and can't help the smallest sort of fond smile from curling around his lips. Loud, he murmurs, setting a finger just below his own eye, before moving his hand back up again to cover it. Looking through just one is enough. Suguru winces sympathetically as he reaches over to tug the shades a little more closed. You probably would feel better if you just went back to sleep, he says, and he's both right and incredibly wrong because he doesn't know. No, Satoru rushes to say as the fear skitters up his spine like a chill, and then sinks back into the pillows as that feeling he can't remember the name of swims through him again, settling into something cool at the bottom of his stomach. He doesn't like it, but he doesn't like the heat that emanates from his skin more. I don't want to. Can't. He hears more than he sees Suguru sigh, shifting a little where his weight pins him into the bed. Why not? He mutters, skimming fingertips down his arm until he's pressing the pad of his thumb into Satoru's unused palm again. You were fine last night. No, he grumbles, rubbing at his temple, where the spinning feeling is beginning to pound into a headache. He was only fine because he'd been too exhausted to weather anything else. I can't sleep. I just found my tongue. He worries, and Suguru's cursed energy snaps with a little flare of confusion. You really are out of it, he says, and somehow manages to make it sound concerned and condescending both. Just because he can, Satoru sticks his tongue out at him, a jitteriness making his hands feel numb. For the love of, put it away, Suguru chides, lifting off the hand he has on his stomach to flick at his cheek. I thought you just found it. Put it back before you lose it again, weirdo. Good point. Satoru almost snorts, and it's probably a good thing he doesn't say it out loud, because he thinks hearing it might dissolve him into a fit of hysterical giggles, or maybe tears. He doesn't need any more dissolving. He's practically a puddle where he already is. If you can't sleep, Suguru starts, and Satoru's nervous smile falters for it slipping on his face into something else. Then can you at least just rest? He opens one eye to look up at where Suguru sits on top of him, lovely and living and worry creased into his pretty features. No unconsciousness required, he promises, hair trailing a dark river down his shoulders. Unconsciousness isn't the same as being asleep, Satoru thinks but doesn't say. Sleep is worse. Okay, he agrees, subdued at the idea of doing nothing but resting. He's never rested a day in his life. Absently, he wonders what it's like. Suguru leaves his leg hooked over his waist, head held up by his elbow, hand resting under his chin as he slides his weight away. His hair is long like this, though still short compared to how he remembers it, cascading down in a wavy shadow that almost looks like it should be moving with the way the wind shrieks outside. It reminds him of lazy afternoons as teenagers, the only time Suguru had ever let it down. It reminds him of edged meetings and twilight hours, always tense and yet something relieved after he'd started wearing it loose, and Satoru hadn't been allowed to see him anymore. He shivers as the hand on his side curls around his ribs and tugs him a little closer, encouraging him to fall a little more onto Tone's shoulder. The calluses on Suguru's palm from weapons training drag roughly along the divots of his ribcage, strange after so long unfamiliar, leaving little sparks of stars in their wake. Actually, Suguru says, and then stops mid-sentence as he seems to think something over, eyeing the nightstand over Satoru's shoulder. Huh? He mumbles, brows furrowing, when Suguru leans over him, stretching to grab, the thermometer. He turns again to momentarily set it on the windowsill while he leans over a second time to nab his tissue box. It's closer to where he lays, and a much easier reaching distance than the nightstand. Satoru realizes, as he's effectively squished a third time. While Suguru digs around in his bedside drawer, he can vaguely recall that he used to have bad allergies. If you spike over 38, I'm making Shoko deal with you. Suguru informs him, finally leaning back over again to set everything on the windowsill, and Satoru doesn't quite manage a scoff. Mean, he mutters, subdued, wondering if he actually could get rid of the temperature spike with reversed cursed. It's probably his body being a dick and trying to attack itself, since he knows it's not viral from his lack of symptoms. It's something internal, maybe even from how different his cursed energy seems to be from when he was originally 15. It's darker now, heavier even, more potent with his rage and pain and insanity. You'll have to forgive me for not wanting my best friend to cook his brain like an egg, Suguru snarks overly politely, his stupid closed lip smile menacing with his eyes narrowed to fake happy slits. Maybe I want to boil alive, Satoru says, tilting into Suguru's shoulder and inhaling the faint scent of the lavender body wash he uses, wondering if it might be preferable to death to choking on his own blood. I haven't tried that before. He'd used to take showers that would scald his skin red. Would it be similar? That implies you've tried other horrible things, Suguru responds, not knowing just how true the words are. Here, he murmurs a long few moments later, slipping his fingertips under his chin to tilt his face up. The glass is colder than before, from resting by the window where the temperatures dropped with the coming storm. It sears against the soft flesh of his mouth oddly when he lets his lips part. Maybe he is sort of burning up after all. Keep it under your tongue. Yes, mother, Satoru mocks, though it sounds more like yes, mother, with the glass in his mouth. He only registers Suguru's too excited grin too late. Wait, he starts only to be interrupted with two waggling eyebrows and a look steeped in the feeling of vicious revenge. It's almost sort of amazing how easy the old banter is, even though it's been years and a lifetime apart. It's almost sort of depressing how simple the old banter is, when it's been taunting him like a poltergeist every time he sees Suguru's smiling face in the dark. Kinky. Suguru gloats with all the glee of someone constantly on the end of a shitty sex joke. Tell me, what do you do with your free time? Satoru doesn't immediately respond, busy covering his face with his hands to hide how he swallows thickly. This is real, he reminds himself. It is real. Fuck you, he mutters tiredly between his teeth, something like contentedness coated in sadness and heavy, with a melancholic pain sitting like lead on his sternum. You're laughing. I'm on my deathbed and you're laughing at me. Try again when you actually hit 38, Suguru says, instead of the things he always does. I laughed at you when I was on my own. Settling back into his side of the small twin and the one pillow Satoru hasn't stolen sometime throughout the last 6 hours. Guess I'll have to. He ends up thinking, and then lays quietly for a moment over the realization that he was still 28 when he was sealed, unknowing of how old he was when he died in the prison's unmoving pace of time if he is dead. He doesn't really know where he is. A dream, a nightmare, a life he isn't sure how to live. He'll figure it out eventually, but he is pretty sure he died. How else would he have escaped that unending darkness? Satoru? Suguru murmurs, trailing fingers through his hair, worried because he's silent, and he shakes his head just enough to get the motion across. Nothing, he mumbles, and unclenches his jaw when Suguru reaches for the thermometer. He taps the glass as he looks at it, frowning, but not scowling. It went up, like 0.2 degrees. You're still 37, he says, and Satoru... Hi! And Satoru drags a hand down his face, wincing at the feeling of his own clammy skin. You'll probably sweat it out soon if it's this high, Suguru sympathizes and sets the glass back on the windowsill before he settles down onto the pillows again. Or I'll cook myself, Satoru grumbles and tentatively turns into Suguru's collarbone, feeling overly hot when his forehead meets a slip of skin bared under his old draping sleep shirt. Or you'll cook yourself, Suguru agrees, winding fingers up into the hair on the back of his head, pulling him a little closer from the legs still hooked over his hips. The heel settled in the crook of his bare knees. His other hand comes to sit on his ribs again, sliding down his side until it pools in the divot of his waist, warm but not warmer than himself. Keep talking, Satoru mumbles, almost a plea when Suguru doesn't say anything else, leaning into the press of his body and desperate for more of it even as it scatters him. Want to stay awake. That's wishful thinking, Suguru snorts, and then wheezes slightly when Satoru socks him in the stomach with one pulled back fist. Fine, fine, he grumbles, annoyed, even though his hands stay lax and gentle where they rest along his skin. It's one of the many reasons he'd loved Suguru. He'd been gentle just as he'd been sharp, and perfectly aware of which to be when. Had he, though? A stray voice hisses and he ignores it, just as he ignores the memories of being told about finding 2 little girls in a cage years down the line, the memories of dark eyes glittering with confidence and uncertainty both. How about... He falls silent for a long moment as he searches for something to say, and Satoru refuses to close his eyes, even as he curls his hands into the front of Suguru's faded band shirt. It's disgustingly cozy like this. He doesn't know who he is like this. Oh, I know. How about I list all of the reasons why Pokemon is superior to Digimon? Digimon is better, he refutes, the words a little weaker as exhaustion makes his limbs heavy, and Suguru sighs like he's a wayward soul who needs to be saved. Digimon is a ripoff, he protests. Pokemon, however, is the original cool pocket monster game. Satoru listens to him talk, staring out at nothing and half of the world from where he's made himself a home by Suguru's heartbeat. It's loud in his ear, but not enough to drown out the soft patter of rain that kicks up sometime when Suguru starts in on how Pokemon Silver is objectively the best game out of all of the infinite Pokemon adventures. Satoru's always thought he just likes Lugia personally, but he's happy to mumble arguments against something inane. He remembers silly things a lot more than the serious ones. Laying here like he's just 15 and slightly ill and not a prisoner in his own body. It's probably backwards, but it's the small, stupid memories that come back to him. Suguru's emo ponytail, bands all colored in black, a favored one worn into snapping, Shoko's glitter stickers she'd slap on their foreheads after she'd healed them following a rough mission, gold stars and red shiny hearts, Sumiki's ridiculous socks, always patterned in all sorts of animals, things, and weather, how Megami had held on to his beat-up old DS for years despite all the temptation of newer models. He feels jumbled, like his puzzle pieces were scattered, some filed down, some snapped in half, and when he went back to put them all into place again, nothing fit anymore. It doesn't help that he doesn't know what everything looked like when he left, doesn't know the date, who's alive, what happened in Shibuya. He doesn't even remember if it was years in that hell or mere weeks. He sort of hopes it wasn't weeks. It'd be rather pathetic to know he could be reduced to whatever snapping, desperate thing he'd become in just weeks. He's clueless, something he's never been before. Except maybe with Suguru. Although, at least he'd understood what Suguru had been trying to do back then, on some level, one that's probably a lot closer to the surface than he likes to admit. He can empathize with the insanity that he'd fallen down into. It doesn't help him now, really, not yet. If this dream plays out as a life that he's already lived, he thinks it might. It sort of feels real, probably is real, but it still feels like a dream too, something untouchable, ethereal, unable to be grasped because it'll slip right out of his fingers if he tried, no matter how surreal it feels, though he's going to try to live it. To be a person with a beating heart and a thumping pulse that doesn't walk through life is little better than an animated corpse. He doesn't really remember how to live, not happily, not properly, but if the dream keeps going and Suguru is still here, then maybe he's willing to try to learn. At some point, he ends up closing his eyes. Suguru's hand carding through his hair is hypnotically tiring, and he's warmer than he's been in a long time, fever notwithstanding. He doesn't know if he drifts off either, just that at some point the world goes quiet save for the rain pattering along the window, the thump of the heartbeat below his ear, and the howl of the wind outside. It's the closest to peace he's been in a while. Okay, yes, Ruth, I know I need to feed you. Alright, that is where we're gonna stop for today. that we got through, I think, 3 chapters. I enjoyed doing this one. Definitely a shorter stream, but I can smell dinner being cooked. Only an hour and a half. That's okay. I can smell dinner being cooked, and I have other things I need to do today, but I thought I would just hop on to do this real fast. I'll be posting it to my YouTube later today. Yeah, I hope everyone has a lovely day, and thank you for watching.